Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we speak openly about what it really takes to connect people at work. From internal comms and knowledge sharing to the messiness of change and the rise of AI, we go beyond best practices to unpack what's working, what's not, and what's worth rethinking. Our host, Bourgeault-Trickey, has spent over 10 years in internal comms, building and launching intranets for organizations in telecoms and finance. He now leads client services at Happeo, where he's helped over 120 businesses across the globe create and grow engaging digital workplaces that drive organizational goals and objectives. If you care about how people in your organization share, learn, and adapt, this is your show. And if you're looking for a modern digital HQ, you can find us at happeo.com.
Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we explore the messy, brilliant, and occasionally unfiltered world of internal communications, knowledge management, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Bourgeault-Trickey, Principal of Client Services at Happeo. Today I'm joined by Claude Baudoin, an independent consultant on IT strategies, standards, and his favorite topic, knowledge management. Claude worked in the industry for 35 years prior to becoming a consultant, and he's worked on everything from building a global community of practice, developing large enterprise taxonomies, and leading a large internal wiki project at Schlumberger. Claude's also an author, a patent holder, and a longtime voice in the IT and knowledge management communities. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Nice. So with the podcast, we normally start off with our unmuted moments. And so I've got a bit of a different question for you today, which is, what's one moment that made you fall in love with the work you do or totally question your life choices?
So when I was working for a multinational company, we were sort of a bit of a pioneer in communication and collaboration at the time. And in 1981, I was able to send the first message from our Paris area office to colleagues in Houston. One colleague actually framed the message on his wall and said, "I exchanged an email with Claude." And that's when I realized, that this sort of international dynamic sharing of knowledge and information through what was not yet the web, but through email at the time, was going to be a revolution.
I can only imagine. That must have been quite something. Go and tell all your family and friends. They probably couldn't even follow along what was happening. So, yeah, that's great. So as far as the next sort of segment we want to dive into here, it's setting the stage. So I wanted to ask, what are the hallmarks of an organization that has good knowledge management? What does it feel like when you're there?
Great question. So to me, it would be an organization that understands that KM starts with the people. Who are the experts? What do they know that others need to learn from them? Is there a group of novices who are hungry for the knowledge that the experts have? And does the organization understand the need to facilitate that sharing of information? So the human aspect of knowledge management is palpable in a good organization that understands this. People are not just like looking at their screen and searching in SharePoint. They really ask themselves, who are the experts? How are we going to create opportunities to share? Do we organize a lunch and learn when someone is coming back from a conference with some new knowledge that they gain? That's what a good knowledge management organization feels like.
So it isn't really kind of like an automatic response. There is sort of that trained or that sort of built learning or built culture. And so that's why we need to consider, that having these consultants or having knowledge managers within organizations. So I'm kind of curious, like as a follow-up, like when people think about your role, what's the biggest thing that they tend to misunderstand? So like what's the most common knowledge management myth you hear, and what's the reality?
Well, I think the most common misunderstanding is that people just need to buy some good tools, that it's an IT solution. We saw that with enterprise search. We see that with AI now, and people think that the tool solves the problem. There's almost been a defocusing on knowledge management in the past 20 years due to what I think is a mistaken belief that the solution lies in IT tools. The reality is that the tool is there to support the people in the process, but it does not result in good knowledge management just by itself.
So I guess maybe again to kind of dig deeper, what's the hardest thing about knowledge management that no one talks about then?
I think it's the maintenance of the knowledge, what's required to make sure that the knowledge remains relevant, remains current. Uh, knowledge ages, it can become obsolete, it can even become incorrect over time. I mean, you find in companies manuals on how to operate equipment that no longer exists, and people are operating new equipment, but the manual doesn't help them anymore. So a manual is only one small aspect of it, but there needs to be a life cycle of knowledge, and it takes effort to identify what things need to be retired, what things need to be updated. And if you have bad or irrelevant knowledge in whatever repository you use, it makes it harder to find the useful stuff. So that's one key challenge. The other one is extracting tacit knowledge from the heads of people. The people who have the most useful tacit knowledge in their heads may be people who've done their work for the last 30 years. And their job is, I don't know, climbing on telephone poles to do repairs. You're not going to make them sit down in front of a computer and type up everything they know. So how do you, I mean, you won't do that because that's not what they like to do, and that's not what they're good at. So how do you extract that tacit knowledge in order to make it more explicit? I'm a big fan of storytelling, following people with a microphone and a camera and say, why are you doing things the way you're doing? Please talk while you're doing your job and tell me what you're doing, what you know, why you're doing that way. And then capturing those stories and sharing them through video clips and podcasts and things like that.
Yeah. We'll maybe talk about it a little later in the session, but I think maybe there's some interesting pieces there around like where automation could potentially facilitate that kind of flow, or like how, where have you maybe seen that? But for now, maybe we'll talk about the next section, which is around more like the real world knowledge management wins and challenges that you see as a result of sort of setting up these systems. So I was curious if you can maybe share a time when knowledge management strategy made a real difference for the businesses you've been helping. And maybe like what's a small internal change you've made that had a surprisingly big impact on knowledge management?
So a couple of my colleagues around, I don't know, 2007, 2008, raised the idea of doing an internal Wikipedia, so something that would look and feel like Wikipedia, but it would be internal to the company, and therefore it could contain confidential information that you wouldn't find on Wikipedia. And I ended up sort of being the project leader. And when we started this, we had no idea where this was going to go, and we had a very small budget to do it. But a couple of years later, we had 12,000 articles in that internal Wikipedia, including 1,800 articles that were just an acronym, because we were just as bad as the military in terms of using 3-letter and 4-letter acronyms for everything. And these were just articles that said, oh, XYZ means this. And so that just like took off. And I was told a couple of years later by someone who said, oh, I was in a onboarding session for new employees in Baku in Azerbaijan. And the people who were doing the onboarding said, oh, you should look at the internal Wikipedia. That's where you're going to find everything you need to know. So that was amazing.
You make it sound almost as if it just suddenly sprang into life. I mean, you probably had to set up quite a bit of protocol and standards and governance in order to kind of get that to happen. Or what did that look like? Maybe.
Well, we basically had a certain number of rules and guidance. And of course, the front page of this Wikipedia said, this is the kind of articles we're looking for, and this is the kind of process. The hardest thing was to make people understand that it was their tool. They needed to come in and write stuff. It wasn't going to write itself for them. I was telling people, if you don't know what XYZ mean, create the XYZ article, leave it empty, put in the article XYZ is ... question mark, and then we'll try to make other people aware that there is this stub of an article, and someone else who knows what XYZ means needs to go in and fill it. So it's a collaborative effort. It's not like Web 1.0 where people publish for others. It's Web 2.0 where everyone publishes for everyone. That was the challenge, and so we had some governance around that, and this was really very successful.
Hmm, that's great. We'll talk a little bit more about the people side of things in a moment, but just to kind of close out this part, is the question I wanted to ask was, where in your knowledge management strategy is the biggest struggle or challenges these days? So kind of comparing against, the wiki that you did a little while ago, what is it looking like these days?
Um, these days, I think the question is really how do we integrate all the evolving technologies that are really springing up very quickly, including large language models, etc. How do we integrate that with the rest of the knowledge management structure? And also, how do we address the cultural change about how people digest information? We're in the YouTube and TikTok generation, and maybe some young people would even say, oh, you're showing your age by mentioning YouTube. And now we've moved on to whatever, we've got Slack channels, we use WhatsApp, etc. So these are the challenges that are new today compared to what they were 20 or 30 years ago when I was starting to do this work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of a very interesting piece is, of course, the different demographics across the workforce today and all these sort of changes that go with it. So it's sort of a nice segue into what we were just looking to discuss next, which would be sort of people and knowledge processes. So understanding sort of the people aspect behind all of this. What I wanted to ask to begin was, like, what's harder, getting leadership to care about the knowledge management strategy or getting employees to contribute and follow those standards today?
Oh God, they're both difficult, obviously, but it is a lot easier to convince employees, especially young, dynamic, entrepreneurial ones, of the need for them to participate and help lead the development of enterprise knowledge than to convince managers that this is something that requires their attention. And the first question that executive ask is, how much is that going to cost? And my God, why do we need to spend so much labor, time, and money on this? So we need to educate the executives, and it's harder than educating the frontline workers.
So I guess then the question is sort of like, how do you motivate or enable people to share when they know, or sorry, share what they know without turning it all into a chore?
So you need to make it fun, or exciting, at least. So there's a lot of aspects to it. There's gamification. If you can make it a little bit of a game to compete on who created the most useful page. I mean, we used to have a hall of fame in our Wikipedia. It's like every quarter we said these are the three most interesting articles that have been posted on the wiki this quarter, and here are the names of the people who contributed to those pages, to those articles. So things like that, some rewarding method to give people the recognition they deserve for contributing to the collective knowledge of the organization.
Yeah, that's great. As far as like proactive sort of communicating out the contributions of all of these people, I'm kind of wondering, like, have you seen sort of like best practices of late? That's sort of what that looks like, or anything that comes to mind?
Not really, and I would almost say that I've seen counterexamples of how not to do it, unfortunately. One of my pet peeves is employee evaluation systems. These evaluations that organizations do once a year. I've seen people add a knowledge management or knowledge sharing box in the evaluation form, and tick that box without really knowing exactly what it means, what it represents. And I'm very negatively impressed by those half-baked efforts to pay lip service to knowledge management without really employing a good system. I think that if you had a more continuous way throughout the year to flag when someone does something good about sharing knowledge or identifying knowledge or helping record knowledge, that would be much more effective.
Mm-hmm. Great. I guess maybe the other side of this too is sort of building in these proper behaviors as part of the people shift. So, what, from your point of view, what are some effective ways to onboard new employees to use and support a company's knowledge management system? What have you seen there?
So everyone who gets onboarded, everyone who joins the company has, whether they realize it or not, some knowledge that other people don't have. They're coming from another company where they learn some things, or they're fresh out of school, but they learn some things in their courses. And their new colleagues who are a little bit older, a little bit more experienced, may not have learned certain things that these new people know. So you need to value that new knowledge that gets imported into the organization by virtue of hiring these people. And you need to give them recognition for having that knowledge. And you need to give them the opportunity to say, well, even though I'm new in the organization, I do have things that I can teach other people. And you need to sort of give them their 15 minutes of fame, so to speak, by highlighting what contributions they can immediately make to the organization thanks to the knowledge they're bringing in. And that's usually not part of onboarding, and it should be. People should be asked, what is it? Let's do the inventory of the new knowledge that you're bringing into this organization, and let's give you an opportunity to share that with your new colleagues.
So beyond a system of record, do you kind of see it that there's a role of knowledge management in sort of building the company's culture and community? Is that sort of a crossover for you?
Oh, it's absolutely part of it. I mean, one big aspect of knowledge management is communities of practice. It is the people-oriented mechanism to identify and share the knowledge. And there are well-known methods to organize communities, to make the communities live, to make them vibrant, and to make those communities a key mechanism to support the collection, the capture, the sharing, the storing, and the reuse of knowledge in an organization.
I've definitely seen these communities of practice before, sort of in my work, and I'm wondering, it's something that is sort of a bit of a a terminology that might not necessarily be widely understood or defined. I'm curious, sort of like how you might describe that for somebody who's maybe less familiar with the term.
It's people who have an interest and whose job involves a certain area of expertise and who come together in person and or virtually to establish best practices for the organization in such a way that it is instrumental to the success of the organization. So it is relevant to the business. It improves operations, or it decreases costs, or it increases revenue, it increases customer satisfaction, or whatever. It needs to have a business value. And it also provides motivation and recognition of the efforts and the participation of the members of the community. And that's a very long definition, but you get the gist. I mean, value to the business and value returned to the members of the community. And what's important is that a community of practice is not just a community of experts. It needs to bring together the experts and the ones who need to learn that expertise.
Right. Yeah. I think the other way I've sort of presented it is that there's a means to connect people who may temporarily or like at a very limited way need to know something or need support with something, and then being able to tap into those individuals across the org who might not otherwise be able to be identified so readily. So I think that there's definitely a crossover there of just being able to identify subject matter experts, which is maybe another aspect of the challenge at the org. I'm curious, like, are there other methodologies that you've seen for sort of identifying subject matter expertise as it relates to that?
Well, yes, there are. And one of the key things is to make an inventory of who are the people who possess critical knowledge. It's become less difficult to do so nowadays because almost everyone has a profile on a system like LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in a company where before the existence of LinkedIn, we essentially had an internal LinkedIn, which we called the career network profile. And we put in there voluntarily our expertise, our skills, our areas of interest, our background, etc. And nowadays, 90% of that would no longer need to be in there. It would be on LinkedIn. On the other hand, you have knowledge that you don't want to put on LinkedIn because it might be about proprietary systems and technologies of your organization. So there's still a place to document what things you know and can do that are not things that you can put in the public domain. So there would be, if you wish, an organization-specific component to this profile, and then a link to the rest of your public profile, which would be on LinkedIn. So that's one technique that people should do. So there should be an employee directory should not just be, your name, your position, your title, which department you're in, and what's your email address and your phone number. It should also have a component which is what knowledge do you possess, and that's what we had done. We used an LDAP directory in the company I was in, many years ago. But in that LDAP directory, they had added all sorts of fields that were related to your expertise. And that was really fundamental because then you could find the experts easily. You would search in the employee directory, and instead of searching by location, by name, etc., you could type, microelectronics, and suddenly you would find all the people who had the word microelectronics in their profile in the employee directory.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that, and it sort of ties us into the next topic of discussion, which is around the role of tech with knowledge management. And so I wanted to ask, what role do you think technology should play in knowledge management, and what role should stay in the hands of people?
What I often say is knowledge management equals people plus process plus content plus technology. So, you have the old saying about IT is people, process, and technology. Well, of course, when you talk about knowledge management, you need to add content in there. So it's a jigsaw puzzle of these four elements: people, process, content, and technology. The technology is there to support the rest. Knowledge management is not technology by itself. We've talked about communities of practice, and we've talked about identifying experts. So obviously the people aspect is important. The process aspect is important because knowledge has a life cycle. You need to identify it, classify it, potentially make it explicit, store it, reuse it, maintain it, eventually retire it. Content, obviously, is everything that's in the form of documents, but also podcasts, video clips, audio recordings, cartoons, everything. And then the technology is there to support and unify and connect all that together. But people need to view technology as an important supporting tool, but it is not the essence of knowledge management by itself.
Right. Yeah. But I guess now we're starting to see that shift where the technology is becoming more and more at a capacity where it can, through automation or through oversight, things like that, be able to sort of establish these types of processes, or to be able to even assist with the capture or creation of knowledge. Just thinking multimodal content. I have a document, I need to turn it into a video or a podcast or whatever. Do you kind of see that now as the shift? Is there any kind of interesting things that you've noticed there, maybe?
There's a shift. Large language models and the ability of AI systems to understand and generate language is an important new thing. You can, for instance, imagine that you have some project post-mortem meetings, and that because they're being recorded and transcribed by an AI, that you can actually more easily extract knowledge that was shared during such a meeting that people wouldn't think of documenting explicitly, but now it might be transcribed by AI into a document that ends up into a knowledge repository. You still need to think of the limitations of those tools because, as I mentioned earlier, you've got lots of tacit knowledge in the heads of people, and the tools are not going to be able to go and extract that from the brains of the experts by themselves. If you do not have an activity that causes these experts to express their knowledge, then the tool is not going to be able to capture it. Now, if you can get people to talk about what they do, why they do it the way they do it, how they learn to do it, what are the best practices, what are the things you should not do, don't connect the blue wire to the red wire, things might go boom, some people have that in their head and it's not written anywhere. If you cannot make them say that, then it's not going to end up in the tool regardless how much AI you use.
I think the key there is, as we were just discussing, the communities of practice and subject matter experts, is to just ensure that whatever the flow or the process or the automation looks like, you've got that subject matter expert is sort of having final say or being able to filter what's there. Does that sound
An
good?
example of that is I was talking to a small company in the Houston area several years ago about knowledge management, and people were complaining about the lack of time to document what they had learned after they came back from a conference. They were like, oh, I came back from this 2-day conference. I'm already late for my project. I don't have time to write a memo. I'm like, you need to take time every day to eat lunch, don't you? Well, yes, they said. I said, why don't you grab a sandwich, a little conference room, and invite all the other people around you who need to know what you learned at that conference to sit down with you with their sandwiches for 30 minutes, and you just tell them what you learned. And they looked at me and they were like, oh, that's an idea. So there are things that people can do in terms of the process of sharing knowledge that they don't necessarily know. And now, of course, nowadays, if you recorded that conversation around the lunch table and you actually fed that into an AI system, well, then you would also have a record of that knowledge.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I guess maybe we can transition to our next subject, which is around knowledge management and the communications intersection. So I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between knowledge management and internal communications? So like, where do they overlap and where should they stay distinct? How does AI maybe fit into that picture for you?
So that's a very good question. Knowledge management and internal communications should sort of feed each other, and they often don't. They tend to ignore each other. So when some event happens in a knowledge management sort of sphere, let's say there's a really good internal conference that allowed people to share important knowledge, etc. Communications department should really extol that. They should tout that success. They should make people understand how valuable that was and encourage people in the rest of the organization to emulate that. Conversely, there's things that people in charge of knowledge management should exploit from what the internal communications group might be doing. So they should be working together. They tend to have charters that are initially sufficiently different that they tend to ignore each other. People who are in charge of internal communications do not always understand very much what knowledge management is about. And people in knowledge management, who are often the people in the trenches, the engineers, the manufacturing people, the field service people, they tend to look at internal communications as one of these corporate departments whose job they don't understand and who think are, um, wasting organizational resources, to be blunt. So they need to work better together, and there are opportunities for each of them to carry and amplify the messages of the other.
You were mentioning before there as well, intranets. So I was just sort of thinking, like, what challenges have you seen when communications or internal communications is driving the intranet versus maybe like a knowledge management team owning it? Maybe how do you suggest balancing those perspectives?
So typically on an internet, you have a classification or a categorization of information that is driven by the organization chart, or by the product lines or whatever.
Mhm.
And from a knowledge management perspective, it's completely different. So the structure of an intranet is not always conducive to the good sharing of the knowledge that people need and vice versa. Um, I think that an organization should look at what's called its capability map, which is the range of things that an organization need to know how to do regardless how they do it.
Mhm.
Um, Not so much at the organization chart. And for many people in the organization chart doesn't really matter if what they want to know is what are the best practice in designing a particular type of circuit board. It doesn't matter who does it in the organization. It doesn't matter what the departments are called, etc. What matters is, are we talking about silicon on a chip? Are we talking about etc. So I'm a big fan of taxonomy, of an enterprise taxonomy, which is a way to create a hierarchy of concepts that are relevant to the organization. And depending on the size of the organization and the range of things it does, an enterprise taxonomy could have anywhere between 300 and 3,000 terms in it. And then the intranet should be driven by that. The menu on an intranet, the organization of the pages, etc., should ideally follow the enterprise taxonomy, not just the org chart. And that's one of the things I hope people will realize more. And there are great conferences and great experience records about that. There's a lady, Heather Hedden, who's published multiple books on enterprise taxonomies, and it's absolutely brilliant in terms of the advice on how to organize things so that it's findable, it's relevant, it talks to people, it saves time in searching stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find a lot with the clients that I'm working with, it's easy to get caught up in sort of who owns the content and having more like a department-centric naming convention or department-centric sort of structure for content mapping. And it's sort of the shift I described as like a user-centric content map, or being able to think of like, what's somebody fresh to the organization going to be looking for, as opposed to, your internal nomenclature. Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess the other side of this is like transitioning again into intranet consideration. So based on your experience, what do you think is the role of intranets in the future of knowledge management as we go forward?
Well, ideally, the internet should be the entry point for anyone who's searching for anything relevant to their job in the organization. And I recently consulted for a company where the R&D VP was like, well, we use so many different IT systems because the electrical engineers using certain CAD tools and the mechanical engineers using other tools, and the software people are all using Confluence and Jira, etc. And when I want to know the status of a project which involves software, hardware, etc., I don't know where to go. And so the intranet should obviously facilitate that. He should be able to go to a portal page, type the name of the project that he wants to look at, and he would find all the links to all the places where the information about the project, as well as all the knowledge relevant to that project, the methodologies, the best practices, the standards, the component libraries, etc., should be able to find that through a single entry point, which I called for them the portal. You can call it the intranet. And again, today, the way intranets are organized often obscure this. And you need to ask people, what is it that you need to look for every day in your job, as opposed to a top-down idea that management has about how things should be organized.
Hmm. Hmm. If we expand that scope and start to look more into the future side of things, like what do you think the future of knowledge management looks like in 2 to 5 years? When you imagine the future of it, like what excites you right now based on what you've seen as challenges in the past?
Well, there's a utopian view and there's a dystopian view, like in many cases. So the utopian view is that we'll have a well-integrated environment which involves the people, the content, the technology, where people are both easily using the knowledge that's been accumulated, but they're also constantly participating into capturing that knowledge, classifying it, storing it, maintaining it, etc. So the utopian view is the tools facilitate this sort of seamless life cycle where knowledge is surfaced and it's evident and it's used and it's there at your fingertips when you need it, where you need it, and it's all relevant and current. The dystopian view is that people are going to start believing incorrectly that thanks to the advances of AI, you don't need to do anything anymore. AI will solve everything. I can go and type a question and I'll get the right answer. Well, AI is not going to invent the knowledge. The knowledge needs to be there for AI to digest it and regurgitate it to you. So if you just have AI working in a vacuum because you're not making any people-based effort to capture and extract and render the knowledge, well, then you're going to have what some people call the model collapse, where AI keeps feeding on itself and then it starts hallucinating and repeating itself and not integrating any new information that comes from the people. So hopefully we're not going to get into the dystopian situation. The utopian one is going to be hard to achieve, but that's what the future needs to be about. It's how do we combine the great evolution of the technology with maintaining a focus on involving people in this life cycle.
Yeah, so always preserving the fact that you still need these knowledge experts. You need to identify them. You need to build them into the processes and all of that.
And you need to have activities that you encourage among people, including the experts and the non-experts, to facilitate this identification and this sharing of the knowledge.
That's great. Maybe we'll kind of switch back to the past from comparing the future. So if you could go back and give yourself, your younger self, one piece of advice about managing knowledge, what would it be for those who are kind of looking to start their quest?
I think one of the things I probably did too much at one point is strive for perfection to the point of delaying the benefits of having something that's good enough but not perfect. So I would say to people, don't strive for perfection and keep saying, oh, I'm not finished with this document. Oh, I can't share this because I haven't yet written down everything that I need to tell you guys. And then 6 months later, I'm sorry, I haven't had the time to do it. I need to do it. And it keeps going on like that. Use the 80-20 rule. 80% is good enough. It takes 20% of the time to get 80% of the knowledge, and unfortunately, it gets 80% of the time to get the remaining 20%. So don't do that. Also, in addition to not necessarily insisting on perfection and deciding what's good enough, remember to involve other people. Don't do it by yourself. That would probably be also something I did too much when I was younger, was trying to absolutely do and finish everything by myself instead of assembling a small group of other interested people around me to help me with what I was doing. It's absolutely valuable to have other people critique what you do. It may be uncomfortable at times, but that's going to make whatever you're documenting, whatever you're sharing with other people, much better to do it with others than to just do it by yourself.
That's really interesting. Yeah, just in considering the idea of all this knowledge capture and knowledge management, We, of course, need to have subject matter experts who are developing this content, but we almost need the audience to sort of validate or confirm the relevancy of this stuff going forward, right? So that's great. We're pretty much at time now. So that's it for this episode of Unmuted. And thanks for joining us today, Claude.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to explain to you what I think I've learned.
That's great. So for those of you out there, if this sparks something for you, please share it with a colleague, because knowledge only matters when it's shared, as we've heard today. And don't forget to follow the show for more conversations that help us all stay a little more connected and a little less muted. We hope you'll join us next time on Happeo Unmuted. Thanks, everyone.